The meeting room on the council station was cold. It was always cold on Vorath ships and stations. The 5 alien species that made up the Fringe Compact sat around a wide, circular table, and none of them looked happy. The lights above flickered once, then held steady. Outside the tall windows, the stars sat still and silent, the way they always did, not caring at all about the war being lost below them. Fleet Admiral Voran opened the meeting. He was a Vorath, tall and gray-skinned, with 7 long arms that he kept folded close to his body when he was thinking hard. He placed a data screen on the table and slid it to the center so everyone could see the numbers. The numbers were bad. In the past 2 years, the Karath Syndicate had taken 3 of the Compact's systems. They had burned outposts, taken prisoners, and absorbed everything they could find. At the rate things were going, the Compact would be finished in 4 months. Voran said this plainly, without decoration. There was no point dressing up a disaster. The Duraxi commander, a heavy 4-legged being named Groth, made a sound low in his throat. He had hired 3 different mercenary groups in the past year. All 3 had taken the money, gone out to fight the Karath, and come back broken or not come back at all. The Karath were fast, organized, and very good at war. They had been doing it for a long time. The Cylon representative tapped her thin fingers on the table. The Morwen elder stared at the floor. The Veld sat with his eyes half closed, which meant he was either thinking or giving up. It was hard to tell with the Veld. Then a small voice came from the far end of the table. Council Aide TV was young by Vorath standards. She was not a general or an admiral. She handled paperwork, arranged meetings, and kept records. Nobody usually asked her opinion in rooms like this one, but she had been doing her own reading late at night after everyone else had gone to sleep, and she had found something. She asked if she could show the room a file. Voran nodded. She pulled it up on the main screen. What the room saw was old security footage from a place called Ganthor Station, a mining outpost near the Ganthor Belt. 3 years ago, a Karath raiding force had attacked it. They sent over 200 soldiers. The station only had 12 defenders. By any normal math, the station should have fallen in a matter of hours. It did not fall. It held for 9 days. The 12 defenders were human. The room watched in silence as the footage showed them moving through the station's corridors in small groups, using the station's own systems against the attackers. They rerouted the gravity plating to knock Karath soldiers off their feet. They used coolant pipes to flood corridors with freezing air. They turned mining drones into mobile traps. They cut the lights in certain sections and moved through the dark without any visible difficulty. When the Karath tried to push through a main corridor in force, they found it blocked by debris stacked so carefully that it took the attackers half a day to clear while the defenders picked at them from above. At the end of 9 days, 47 Karath soldiers were dead. The rest had retreated. All 12 human defenders were alive. The Duraxi commander asked Voran to play it again. Voran did. Groth watched the whole thing a second time without making a sound. Then he said slowly that he did not understand how 12 beings had done that. Tev said she thought that was exactly the point. She explained what she had learned about humans in her late-night reading. They were a young species, barely a century into space travel. They were physically unremarkable by galactic standards. They were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the best armored. They had no special biology that made them resistant to weapons or able to survive in hard environments without equipment. What they had, she said carefully, was something harder to measure. They had a very strange relationship with situations that should make them stop. The Veld elder opened his eyes fully for the first time in the meeting. Tevi continued. Humans had a long history of ground war on their home planet, going back thousands of years before they ever reached space. They had fought each other endlessly, across every kind of terrain, with every kind of weapon available to them at the time. And in all of that history, the one thing that showed up again and again was that a human force, even a badly outnumbered one, would keep finding ways to fight as long as any of them were breathing. They did not have a cultural tradition of accepting defeat as a logical outcome. They seemed, as far as TV could tell from the historical records, to treat losing as a temporary condition. The Morwen elder made a soft sound. It was not quite a laugh. It was something between surprise and discomfort. Tev told the room that the Terran Mercenary Corps had a unit available. They were called the Iron Wall Company. Their commanding officer was a man named Dale Carver. She had already sent a preliminary inquiry to their liaison office on Waypoint 11 3 days ago without official authorization. She apologized for that. Varan looked at her for a long moment. Then he asked what Dale Carver had said. Tev said the response had come back in 6 hours. She put it on the screen. It was professional and short. It confirmed availability, asked 2 pages of very specific tactical questions about the Kareth's current positions and supply lines, and ended with a single unusual request. Send everything available on the Kareth command structure, not their military specs, but their psychology. What their commanders valued, what they feared, what they had never seen before. The room was quiet after that. Groth said, that he was not sure 40-something humans could do what 3 full mercenary battalions had failed to do. Tev said she was not sure either, but she pointed out that the 3 battalions had all tried to fight the Kareth the way the Kareth expected to be fought. The humans, from everything she had read, did not do that. Varan called a vote. It passed by a narrow margin. The Veld elder voted yes last, after sitting still for a long time with his eyes closed again. When he finally raised his hand, he said one thing. He said that when a species had spent thousands of years learning how to kill each other, it was probably wise to let them practice on someone else for a while. Tev sent the full contract offer that night. She included every piece of intelligence they had on the Kareth. So she also included the battle footage from Ganthor Station. Not because Dale Carver had asked for it, but because she thought he might want to know that someone had been paying attention. She sat at her desk after she sent it and looked out at the stars for a while. She was not a soldier. She did not know if this was going to work. But she had read enough human history to know one thing. When humans decided something mattered, they had a way of making the universe agree with them, whether the universe liked it or not. She turned off her desk lamp and went to find some sleep. 4 months was not very long. She hoped it would be enough. The Iron Cross came out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Cathara system, like it had all the time in the world. It was not a beautiful ship. It was boxy and patched in several places, yet with one docking clamp that was clearly newer than the rest of the hull around it. There were words painted along the side in large, uneven letters that the Vorath translator took 3 minutes to decode. When the translation came back, it read, "If you can read this, you are already in range." Nobody on the council station said anything about that for a while. Fleet Admiral Varan watched the ship dock from the observation deck. Beside him stood Tive, who had not slept well in 2 weeks and was holding a very large cup of something warm. She watched the boarding ramp lower and felt her stomach tighten slightly. 41 humans walked off that ship. Varan counted them twice because he kept expecting more to follow. 41. 29 soldiers, 4 engineers, 3 medics, 2 intelligence analysts, 2 communications officers, and 1 linguist. They moved with a calm, unhurried ease, looking around the station with the relaxed curiosity of people who found new places interesting rather than threatening. Their equipment was worn but clean. Their faces were various shades and shapes. Some were tall, some were not. They looked collectively like they had simply decided to show up and see what happened. Captain Dale Carver came last. He was lean, somewhere in his late 30s by human age, with a face that had been outside in bad weather for a long time. He had a small scar above his left eye and another along his jaw, and he walked with the unhurried ease of someone who had learned a long time ago that moving fast only mattered when it was actually necessary. He shook Varan's hand in the human fashion, nodded to Teve, and asked when they could start the briefing. The briefing took 4 hours. Compact generals laid out everything: the 3 lost systems, the Kareth fleet positions, the transit corridors, the forward command base on Cathara 4. Varan showed the numbers he had shown at the council meeting. The other generals showed maps, movement charts, casualty reports. Dale sat and listened to all of it without interrupting. He asked no questions while the presentations ran. He only wrote a few things down, and when TV craned her neck slightly, the notes he was taking did not seem to be about fleet positions or weapon counts at all. When the briefing ended, Dale asked his single question. He asked who in the Kareth command structure was most afraid of looking weak. The generals looked at each other. Groth asked what that had to do with anything. Dale said, politely, that it had to do with everything. Over the days that followed, the Compact watched the human units settle in and immediately do almost nothing that looked like war preparation. There was no drilling in formation. There was no running weapons checks in long organized rows. The soldiers cleaned their equipment quietly, ate together in the station canteen, and seemed genuinely interested in talking to anyone willing to talk back. A Vorath maintenance worker named Sevrol later told TV that 3 of the human soldiers had spent an afternoon helping her repair a stuck ventilation panel, and that they had been very good company. The 2 analysts, Lou Parham and Ben Ozawa, set up a workspace in a small room near the communications center and began working hours that made the Compact staff uncomfortable. Lou was sharp-featured, fast-talking, and moved through data files the way some people moved through crowds, knowing exactly where she was going. Ben was quieter, more careful, and had a habit of staring at a single data point for 10 minutes before writing anything down. Together they built what they called a pressure map of the Kareth Syndicate. The pressure map was not a military map. It did not show ships or weapons or defensive lines. It showed relationships. Who in the Kareth command answered to whom? Which officers had been promoted quickly and which had been passed over? Where supply lines were running smoothly and where they were stretched? Which systems the Kareth were using heavily and which ones they were only nominally controlling? It showed pressure points, the places where the Kareth structure was holding weight it did not want to hold. Meanwhile, the linguist Cara Lynn worked with a Vorath cultural historian in the station archives. She was learning Kareth, not the trade dialect that most Compact officers used for communications intercepts. The real language, the military language, with its specific words for hierarchy and honor, and the particular shame that came from being outmaneuvered by someone you had considered beneath you. She had started learning it 4 weeks ago from a stolen data archive, and she was already reading field reports in the original. Dale moved between all of it, asking questions, reading files, sitting in silence for long stretches, and occasionally having long conversations with his soldiers that, to Compact observers, did not appear to be about anything military at all. The Veld Elder asked Tevi at one point what the humans were actually doing. Tev said she thought they were learning. What emerged from all of this 10 days in was a picture of the Kareth that the Compact's own analysts had not quite assembled. The Kareth Syndicate was not, at its root, a war machine. It was a raiding culture that had grown very large. Its military success had always been built on speed, shock, and the psychological certainty that resistance was pointless. Every campaign in their history had followed the same shape: hit hard, hit fast, demonstrate that you cannot be stopped, offer terms, absorb. They had never once encountered a prolonged resistance that did not eventually fold. They had never needed to fight a long, grinding, uncertain war because they had always ended things before that kind of war became possible. Dale read Lou's final report in one sitting. Then he called the whole unit together in the main briefing room. He explained the situation simply. The Kareth, did not lose wars. They had never lost a war. That was not because they were unbeatable. It was because they had only ever fought enemies who believed they were unbeatable. The moment an enemy stopped believing that, the whole machine the Kareth had built, the fear, the speed, the overwhelming force, started to lose its power. Because all of that force was pointed at the enemy's will to fight, and if the will did not break, the force had nothing to push against. He said the plan was not to match the Kareth ship for ship or soldier for soldier. The plan was to cost them more than they had ever paid for anything. Not in one big battle, but in 100 small ways, constantly, until their commanders started making decisions from fear instead of confidence. And then, when they made those decisions, to be exactly where those decisions led them. The room was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then Pete Garza, the lead engineer, a broad-shouldered man with grease permanently under his fingernails, raised his hand and asked if he could see the full technical specs on Kareth security systems. Dale said yes. Pete nodded and went back to his workspace. The rest of the unit began moving, each person to their own task, without ceremony or noise. There was no speech. There was no dramatic moment. It simply began. Tevi watched all of this from the corridor outside the briefing room. She had not been invited to the meeting, but she had stood by the door anyway, listening. When the humans came out and moved past her, Dale caught her eye and gave her a small nod. She nodded back. She walked back to her desk and sat down. 4 months, she thought. Let us see. The first thing the Kareth knew about it was silence. A supply depot on a small moon, deep in what the Syndicate considered safely controlled space, simply stopped responding to routine check-ins. It was not destroyed. There was no explosion, no fire, no debris field floating in the dark. The place was simply quiet in a way it was not supposed to be. When the Kareth sent a reconnaissance force to check, they found the depot intact. The buildings were standing. The equipment was still in place. But the fuel cells were drained. The munitions were gone or made useless. The communications hardware had been taken apart with what appeared to be a great deal of patience and care. And the garrison, all 14 of them, were sitting in the middle of the main storage room, tied up with their own equipment straps, alive, unhurt, and deeply unable to explain what had happened. The garrison commander, when freed, said they had not heard anything. No alarms, no sounds of breaking, no indication that anyone had been there until they woke up already tied. She said this with the specific kind of embarrassment that comes from having no good explanation for a bad situation. The Kareth command filed the incident as unusual and sent a larger security detail to the depot. They did not yet connect it to the humans they knew had been hired by the compact. The depot was too far inside their controlled space for that to seem likely. They assumed a compact sabotage team, moved in and out quickly. They ran a security review and moved on. The security review was what Pete Garza had been counting on. He had spent 8 days before the depot raid reverse engineering a Kareth security scanner from a broken unit the compact had recovered at a burned outpost. The scanner was not complicated once you understood its logic. It worked by detecting specific chemical signals that Kareth soldiers produced, a biological tag that their armor also carried. Pete had built a small device, handheld, cheap to make, that broadcast a false version of that signal. To the scanner, the humans simply registered as Kareth. It took him 4 hours to build once he understood the system. In the security review after the depot raid made the Kareth tighten their scanner protocols, which meant they upgraded the signal their systems looked for. Pete read the new protocols from an intercepted technical update, rebuilt his device in an afternoon, and moved on. 4 days after the depot, a Kareth patrol vessel responded to a distress beacon in an asteroid field near one of the transit corridors. The beacon was broadcasting on a Kareth emergency frequency, the kind used when a small craft was in trouble and needed a fast pickup. The patrol ship, 30 crew aboard, dropped out of faster-than-light travel close to the source signal. What it found was not a damaged Kareth ship. Ben Ozawa had spent 3 days building the signal from recordings of real Kareth emergency broadcasts. I was making sure the frequency and the encoded identification markers were correct. Kara Lynn had checked his work and found 2 small errors that would have made a sharp communications officer suspicious. He fixed them. The beacon was, by every measurable standard, exactly what it claimed to be. The patrol ship was caught in a gravity anchor field operated by 2 compact vessels that had been sitting cold and quiet in the asteroid field for 16 hours, running on minimum power so that their signatures would read as rock. The patrol ship could not jump to faster-than-light travel while the anchor was active. Its communications were jammed by a system Ben had rigged from salvaged parts, and one very creative interpretation of how a compact navigation buoy's transmitter could be repurposed. The boarding took 11 minutes and 40 seconds. Dale's soldiers moved through the patrol ship in 4 teams, fast and quiet, going exactly where they needed to go because Pete had memorized the patrol-class ship layout from a technical manual Kara Lynn had found in the stolen data archive. The crew was moved to the cargo hold. Nobody was killed. Nobody was seriously hurt. The ship's navigation core, its communications memory, and its entire routing database were removed in under an hour and carried back to the Iron Cross. Caroline spent 3 days going through the data. She found movement schedules, patrol rotations, communication encryption keys, and the personal message logs of 2 Kareth officers, one of whom turned out to be the nephew of a senior syndicate commander. That last detail went into Lou's pressure map with a small red marker. Yet the Kareth did not know the patrol ship had been boarded. They thought it had suffered a technical failure and drifted. By the time they realized the ship's core was missing, the Iron Cross was 3 systems away. This was the part that began to change things inside the Kareth command. It was not the losing of equipment that bothered them. Equipment could be replaced. It was the not knowing. The depot was explainable as a compact sabotage team. The patrol ship could be explained as equipment failure. But when a 3rd incident happened 10 days later, and then a 4th, and the incidents kept not looking like the same thing twice, the explanations started getting harder. A Kareth colonel returned to his command tent to find all his maps had been replaced with a single sheet of paper. On it was a simple hand-drawn image of a figure with one hand raised, thumb pointed up. Kara Lynn, when told about it later, explained to Varan that in human culture this gesture meant something between good job and I see you and we are doing fine. The colonel filed an urgent report. His superiors read it and felt, for the first time, something that did not quite fit into their usual categories for war. Nina Cole, one of the 3 field medics, moved through all of this quietly and steadily. She treated her own unit when they needed it, which was not often. She also, twice during the campaign, treated Kareth prisoners. The first time was a young soldier who had been hit by debris during the patrol ship boarding. Nina cleaned the wound and bandaged it without being asked. The soldier stared at her the entire time with an expression that nobody in the unit needed a translator to read. It was confusion. Pure, clean confusion. Nina told him, through Kara Lynn's translation on a handheld screen, that she was a medic, and that was what medics did. He did not say anything back. But the way he looked at her afterward was different from the way he had looked at her before. And that difference was not a small thing. The Kareth Fleet Admiral Veth Kar issued a priority alert after the 5th incident. He named the humans specifically. He said they were to be treated as high-value targets. He placed a bounty on Dale Carver by name. Dale's response was sent through compact communications and then, on Dale's specific instruction, forwarded directly to the Kareth command frequency. It was 1 sentence. It said, "Thank you for the compliment." Veth Kar read the message 3 times. He was not a man who lost his temper easily. He had run 16 campaigns without losing one. He sat for a long while after reading it, and the thing he felt was not anger exactly. It was the early edge of something he had very little experience with. It was the feeling of not being sure what came next. Veth made his decision on a cold morning station time, sitting in the forward command base on Cathara 4 with his senior officers around him. The maps on the table showed what the past 6 weeks had done to his logistics. 3 supply routes disrupted, 1 patrol vessel gone, 4 outposts raided. Communication encryption rolled over twice. Every time his command adapted, something else changed, and the changes were never in the same place twice. He was not afraid. Veth had not been afraid in a very long time. But he was frustrated, and frustration in a commander of his experience quickly became a kind of cold, hard focus. He had been letting the humans play their game because he had assumed they would run out of ways to play it. They had not run out. They kept finding new ones. So he decided to end it the way he had ended everything else in his career. With overwhelming force applied directly to the problem, he was going to push his entire fleet through the Cathara transit corridor, take the remaining compact systems, and finish the war before the humans could build another trick. 40 warships. Everything the Syndicate had in the region. It would not be elegant. It did not need to be elegant. It needed to be final. What Veth did not know was that his communications core had been replaced. 4 weeks earlier, when the patrol vessel had been quietly boarded and gutted in the asteroid field, the humans had not simply taken the core. They had left something behind. Ben Ozawa had installed a spoofing module in the patrol ship's secondary relay, the kind of component that no routine technical check would catch because it looked identical to the standard part it had replaced. The module fed Kareth Command a steady stream of routing data that was accurate in every detail except for one. It was 3 weeks out of date. Every movement report, every position update, every navigation confirmation that Veth received about the transit corridor was real data. It was just real data from a corridor that no longer existed in the same shape. Pete Garza had spent 3 weeks in the actual corridor with a team of 4 compact engineers. They had worked in silence, in cold, without big equipment, placing small devices along the transit route at precise intervals. The devices were gravity disruption nodes. Each one, alone, did almost nothing. They were too small to show up on a standard sweep and too weak to affect anything on their own. But Pete had mapped out a chain sequence, a timing system adapted by Kara Lynn from a Kareth Agricultural Satellite's irrigation controller, something no military scanner would think to look for. And when that sequence ran, the nodes would fire in a cascade. The cascade would collapse faster than light navigation in a specific stretch of space 200,000 kilometers long. Any ship caught in that zone would drop to sublight travel. And suddenly, without warning, in whatever formation it was holding at the moment of the disruption. 40 warships in tight transit formation would drop out together, bunched, with overlapping fire arcs and interfering point defense systems directly in front of whatever was waiting for them. What was waiting was the entire remaining compact fleet. It had been sitting in the dark for 6 days, engines cold, running on the absolute minimum power needed to keep the crews alive. Cold ships read as dead ships to most long-range scanners. The fleet had positioned itself at the far end of the disruption zone, spread wide, with every firing solution already calculated and locked. The calculations had been done by Lou Parham and 3 compact navigation officers working together. Using the Kareth fleet movement data that Kara Lynn had pulled from the stolen patrol ship core. Dale sat in the Iron Cross's small command room when the battle began. He watched it on the feed and did not say very much. The timing cascade fired on schedule. 40 Kareth warships dropped to sublight. The compact fleet opened fire from 3 angles simultaneously. The battle lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. The compact lost 9 ships. The Kareth lost 23, with the remaining 17 surrendering or retreating in the first hour once the shape of what had happened became clear to their commanders. Veth flagship was taken intact. He was brought aboard the council station the next day. Tevi expected there to be a formal reception. Generals, admirals, the compact council assembled in full. Instead, She got a message from Dale asking her to leave the primary meeting room empty except for a table and 2 chairs. She did what he asked. When Veth Carr was walked in under guard, he found Dale Carver sitting at the table alone. There was a cup of something warm on each side. There was also a copy of the Karth Syndicate's own tactical doctrine manual, translated into the common trade language, placed in the center of the table. It was open to a specific page. Veth Carr looked at it. The page said, in his own military's words, "Never engage an opponent who does not respond predictably to demonstrated force superiority. Such opponents have already accepted their own death and will take you with them." Dale pushed the book slightly toward him and said, "You forgot to read ahead." Veth Carr sat down. He looked at Dale for a long time. He was not a small being, and he was used to being the most dangerous thing in the room. He was not sure that was true right now, and he was not sure it had anything to do with weapons. He asked Dale how he had known about the communications corps. Dale said he had not known for certain. He said it was a reasonable thing to try. That was the part Veth Carr kept thinking about afterward. 2 days before the corridor battle, in the 3rd week of the campaign, a Karth response force had arrived faster than intel projected during an extraction operation. 2 human soldiers did not make it out. Corporal Ray Dunton and Private First Class Amy Solis were killed covering the rest of the unit's withdrawal from a communications relay station on the edge of the 2nd occupied system. That night, Dale sat alone in the Iron Cross's small back office and wrote 2 letters by hand, not typed, written, with a pen on paper. Each letter took him about 2 hours. Nin Cole stood outside the door for part of that time, not going in, just close. The rest of the unit was quiet in a way that was different from their usual quiet. Varan, watching through the feed, asked TV what Dale was doing. Tev explained about the letters. Varan was quiet for a moment. Then he asked why Dale wrote them by hand instead of using a standard message system. Tev said she thought it was because handwriting was slower, and slower meant it cost something, and that was the point. Varan did not say anything after that for a while. He just kept watching. The Karth Syndicate did not fall apart overnight. It took 2 months. Without Veth Carr, without the forward fleet, and with supply lines already worn down by weeks of pressure from the Iron Wall unit, the Karth grip on the 3 occupied systems began to loosen the way ice loosens in spring. Slowly at first, then faster than anyone expected. Compact forces, fighting with new confidence and far better intelligence, pushed back system by system. The Karth soldiers who remained held their positions for a while, then began to fall back. There was no dramatic final battle. There was just a slow and steady reclaiming, outpost by outpost, transit point by transit point, until one morning the maps looked the way they were supposed to look again. Veth Carr remained on the council station through all of it, technically a prisoner, practically a guest. He was given a room, meals, and access to a window. He spent a lot of time at the window. TV checked on him occasionally, not because it was her job, but because she found him interesting in the way that a problem that has been solved is still interesting to think about. He did not say much. He was a man adjusting to a new version of what the universe looked like, and that kind of adjustment takes time. The Karth Syndicate formally requested peace negotiations in the 7th week after the corridor battle. It was the first time in their recorded military history they had made such a request. The compact negotiating team was professional and careful. They brought Dale to the table as an observer. When the Karth delegation filed in, they moved past Dale without any visible reaction, but something in the way they arranged themselves at the table shifted slightly. The way a room shifts when there is a sound just at the edge of hearing. Tevi noticed it. She thought Dale probably noticed it too, though he did not show it. The treaty was signed. All 3 occupied systems were returned. The Karth paid a formal restitution for destroyed outposts and displaced population centers. They accepted a series of monitoring agreements that, 6 months ago, they would have rejected outright. The Compact Council held a formal session to mark the end of the war. Speeches were given. Medals were described, if not yet made. The Veld Elder, who had voted last and most reluctantly to hire the humans, spoke the longest and said the most. The story moved outward from there, the way stories always do when they are interesting enough. Trade routes carry information the same way they carry goods, mixed in with everything else, passed from ship to ship, station to station, translated and retranslated and losing a little precision each time, but never quite losing the shape of the thing. Within 3 months, the account of 41 humans and the Karath corridor had traveled through most of the known compact systems and beyond. It landed differently in different places. The Cylon Military Academy added the corridor battle to its curriculum on asymmetric tactics, analyzing the signals spoofing and the gravity node cascade in careful technical terms. The Duraxi Strategic Council produced a long report on human psychological warfare and what it meant for future diplomatic relations with Earth. A Morwin historian began writing what would become the first galactic standard academic text on Terran military culture. In several places, the story was received with something close to alarm. A species barely a century into space travel had taken apart a major syndicate's military campaign with 41 soldiers, a stolen communications core, some small devices, and a patient understanding of how the enemy thought. The alarm was not about what humans had done. It was about what it implied they could do when there were more of them, with more time, and against an opponent who had not seen it coming. Tev read some of these responses in her official capacity and found them understandable. She had felt something similar herself early in the process, before she had spent enough time watching Dale's unit work to understand the shape of what they were. The fear was reasonable. What people got wrong was the source of it. Humans were not frightening because they were aggressive or bloodthirsty, or because they enjoyed war. Most of the humans TV had known over the past months seemed to not enjoy it at all, in the specific way of people who were very good at something they would prefer not to have needed. What made them frightening was simpler and harder to account for. It was that they did not stop, not because they could not feel fear, not because they did not understand loss, but because they had made a collective decision somewhere in their long and violent history that stopping was not an option they were willing to put on the table. They had decided that the universe did not get to make that choice for them. Tevi wrote all of this in her official report to the Compact Council. She wrote 12 drafts. The final one was longer and more direct than her usual work. She included a specific recommendation. Any Compact member considering a future military engagement against any opponent in any context should make every reasonable effort to have humans on their side before the engagement begins. And any species in the wider galaxy considering an action against humanity or its interests was advised to think about the corridor battle and about the 9 days at Ganthor Station before it, and to ask themselves honestly whether they were prepared for the kind of war that would follow. She marked the report confidential and sent it. Then she went to find Voran. He was on the observation deck, which was where he had been spending more time lately. The docking bay was visible from up here, and the Iron Cross was still in its berth. It was leaving in the morning. Tevi stood beside him, and they looked at the ship for a while without talking. It still had the painted words along the hull. If you can read this, you are already in range. Tev had stopped finding this funny or unsettling. She just found it honest. Varan said he had been thinking about the letters Dale had written, the handwritten ones, after the 2 soldiers died. He said he had commanded forces that lost hundreds, and he had processed the losses through a standard reporting system that was efficient and correct. He said he had not understood at first why Dale's way was different. He thought he understood it a little better now. Tev asked what he thought the difference was. Voran said he thought it was about what you believed the loss meant. If you believed it was a number in a column, you processed it like a number. If you believed it was a person who had come a long way from home to do something that mattered, you spent 2 hours writing it down by hand. The next morning, the compact held a small departure ceremony that Dale had reluctantly agreed to after TV had spent 20 minutes explaining that it was not really for him, it was for everyone else. Compact soldiers lined the corridor to the docking bay. They did not cheer. They stood at attention, quietly, and watched the Iron Wall unit walk past. At the end of the corridor, Varan offered Dale the formal Vorath gesture of respect that was given only to those who had changed the course of history. Dale returned it correctly, because Carolyn had briefed him on Vorath custom. Then he shook TV's hand. Voran asked him one question, and he asked if Dale had ever been afraid during the campaign that it would not work. Dale thought about it for a moment. He said yes, every day. Varan asked how he had kept going. Dale said, "The whole point is that you do it anyway." He walked up the boarding ramp. The Iron Cross undocked cleanly, cleared the station, and moved into faster-than-light travel without ceremony. Somewhere on the far side of the Kareth border, a short internal document was being distributed to every remaining Syndicate military commander at the highest priority level. It was one page. It said that Terran units were confirmed active in the border regions and that command strongly advised against engagement under any circumstances. It said this was not a recommendation. It said this was a recorded warning. I filed in the official military history of the Kareth Syndicate, and that any commander who chose to ignore it did so entirely on their own account. It said, "Do not make us explain this again.